We're just going to look at everything to do with safely sterilizing the dental instruments. There will be a little bit of time at the end if you do have any questions. But what we're going to look at is how we can safely load the autoclaves correctly, ensuring that our instruments are fully sterilized. So it is something we need to look at in terms of whether it be non-vac, S-class and B-class. So we're going to look at what the regulations kind of say. We'll answer some of those questions. One of the big burning questions I get all the time, and I see it on social media, is all about pouches, paper side up, paper side down. There's a big debate going on. So we'll answer those questions as well, because they are very much manufacturer led. So just a little bit about MELAG. So I'm doing this in partnership with MELAG. This is a MELAG presentation. So we are looking at MELAG being a manufacturer of washer disinfectors, but also of pouch sealing units. So the beauty of things like a pouch sealer is that you are able to make the pouch the exact size that you want for your dental instruments. So there's a range of pouch sealers. Sterilisation is really what MELAG are all about. Is where MELAG started in 1951. So we are looking at almost 75 years based in the same site, manufacturing sterilisers and so forth, all looking at decon. And then we have traceability, all to do with how do we track our dental instruments through this entire process to also then be reused on the next patient. So we're going to have a look at that as well and show you some new things that are coming up. So everything that MELAG do, that we do, is all about keeping you safe, patients safe, keeping visitors safe as well. It is the hygiene element. We are specialists in hygiene, so we know that full process. So we're going to focus on the sterilisation side. So a little question about sterilisers. So do all instruments need to be sterilised? Sounds a bit of a pointless question, but it is quite an important one, because certainly in certain countries, certain parts of Europe, for example, there are certain instruments that don't need to necessarily be sterilised. And this is where we classify them into critical and semi-critical. For us in the UK, it doesn't make any difference. All of our instruments are deemed critical. We have no instruments that are deemed semi-critical. So there are some parts of Europe whereby instruments need to be cleaned. They don't necessarily need to be sterilised. And these would be things like a mirror, for example, going into the mouth. That is classed as a semi-critical instrument, or a non-invasive instrument, as we would traditionally call it. And in which case, because it's not going subgingivally, it's not going into the pockets or anything, there's not really a chance that any blood or anything is going to be on it. So it is only required to be cleaned. It doesn't need to be sterilised. But for our regulations in the UK, Scotland, Northern Ireland, England and Wales, we class every instrument as being invasive. So all of them need to go through this full process that you can see on the screen. From the moment those instruments are used on the patient, they are then safely transported in that transportation box. The transportation box in itself must be leak proof and also damage proof as well, so that if you happen to trip up, it's not going to break and it's not going to open up. It also mustn't be too heavy that you cannot carry it with one hand, and it has to be a naked hand. So we have naked hands walking through the practice. We then look at cleaning and disinfection. England and Wales, as far as we're concerned, it is best practice for these pieces of equipment, the washer disinfectors, but certainly within Scotland and Northern Ireland, they are mandatory. We then have inspection and maintenance, looking at our dental handpieces. At what point do we inspect and lubricate our dental handpieces? Well, it is always before this point. It is always before the sterilisation point. We are cleaning them, usually with alcohol-free wipes or through an automated process. We are then oiling them internally and cleaning them internally. We are then processing them through the sterilisation process. We then package our instruments. Now, the guidance changed many years ago that doesn't matter whether you pouch pre-autoclave or post-autoclave, you're still getting a year's storage. So in retrospect, it doesn't matter. However, there are certain instruments that you would want to pouch prior to going through the sterilisation. And that would be something like a dental handpiece, purely because as soon as a vacuum is forced inside the chamber of a vacuum autoclave, there does run a risk that some oil could come out of those handpieces, particularly if they have been quite heavily oiled as well. We are then steam sterilising, and we'll come on to that in a second. We are then approving that cycle, that overall process through the documentation of approval. And we'll touch on the documentation of an approval as well, whether it be a digital element or whether it be a manual paper element. We're then storage and we're transporting. So everything that we do within Decon follows this entire process. But as I said, as far as we're concerned in the UK, all of our instruments are deemed critical or invasive, is what we tend to call it. So steam sterilisation. Oh, excuse me. Let me just go back on that one. Bear with me. So steam sterilisation is the best way to sterilise instruments. Many years ago, we used to use things like dry heat sterilisation, but steam sterilisation is proven to be more effective and reliable in ensuring that those dental instruments are pathogen free. It is also a quicker method of guaranteeing that sterility as well. You're not having to keep it under long heat for a long period of time. Steam is incredibly good at that high temperature of 134 degrees at killing those pathogens. Okay, so we do need to make sure we are using steam sterilisation. Steam sterilisers also, steam when it's in a chamber is also really good at getting into all of those nooks and crannies of those dental instruments. Not one dental instrument we use within a dental practice will be perfectly still. A large majority will have a lot of internal crevices, external crevices, and so forth. And what steam is very good at doing, steam's very good at getting into all of those areas. So steam sterilisation, governed by the regulation called EN 13060, is where we look at. And there's three primary things we look at when we look at steam sterilisation. Is we're looking at temperature, we're looking at time, and we're looking at pressure. So an instrument going into a steam sterilizer at 134 degrees with a pressure of around 3 bar of pressure, which is typically what a vacuum autoclave will look at that 134 degrees, sterilizing for at least 5 minutes, is going to have at least a 6 logarithmic reduction in the amount of pathogens on that instrument. So to put that into context, over that duration of time, that time of 5 minutes, that pressure of 3 bar, that temperature of 134 degrees, if there was 1 million pathogenic organisms on an instrument when it went into the sterilizer, under those 3 areas, you'd be looking at no more than 1 pathogenic organism on the instrument when it comes out the other side. So they're incredibly good. So we do rely on those temperatures. Most traditional sterilizers will look at a 3-minute sterilization holding temperature, which is the EN norm. However, most modern autoclaves do tend to extend that. So they look more towards the 5-minute mark, that it'll physically hold 134 to 137 degrees. And where we see it kind of hits around 135, 135 and a half. And EN 1306 is the EN norm that looks after all of these units you can see here. And obviously what we call these are called benchtop sterilizers, and EN 13060 is the classification that looks after benchtop sterilizers. Now, all manufacturers have to make their equipment to the standards within here. And one of the standards and one of the points that this standard looks at is it looks at the classification of sterilizer. And that's when we're talking about non-vac, S class or B class. So What it says for non-vac is non-vacs are typically what we call downward displacement autoclaves. So the way they kind of work is there's no pump in there, so there's no vacuum pump to pull any air out. And what tends to happen, steam comes in through the top of the chamber, it passively moves around inside that chamber, and by doing that it moves air around. But what it doesn't do is not particularly good at getting air out from in there. So the type of instruments are limited to what can go through a non-vac. So it's very much limited on its load types, and it is important that we do follow those load types. So when we go onto the perforated tray, we make sure that those instruments are placed flat on the tray, that they're not overlapping, and they're certainly not stacked on top of each other when we put them into those perforated trays. Non-vacs in their essence are suitable for solid instruments, non-lumined, non-hollow instruments, because they have no physical way of getting the air out from inside of that chamber. So all they do is just move it around. You've then got S-class, which stands for specific. It's specific to the manufacturers, but the vast majority of S-classes will normally incorporate 1 or 2 vacuum pulses in there. So by the nature of incorporating 1 or 2 vacuum pulses through the use of a vacuum pump, it automatically opens up the S-class to a wider range of load types. So your loading would still be the same. You would still be using the same tray. You would still be putting the instruments side by side. You wouldn't be stacking on top of each other, and you'd still be putting solid solid instruments through there. But the one beauty you do have is you could also put pouched solid instruments through there as well. So something like these pouched scissors you could put in there, okay, and that will safely sterilize within an S-class. Some S-classes, again following manufacturers, would also be suitable for hand pieces as well. Unpouched hand pieces, but they would be suitable for hand pieces as well. Very much looking at what the manufacturers require, what the manufacturers tell you. So S-classes sit in the middle. As I said, they certainly open up the variety of more load types. So it's important to bear in mind for those. And the beauty of an S-class is you kind of get the cycle times of a non-vac, give or take a little bit extra, but not a significant amount of time over a non-vac, but you do get more flexibility. And S-classes are becoming a lot more common now within the markets. We're starting to see a lot less N-class, traditional N-class. And we're seeing a lot more in the option of S-classes coming into the market because of that functionality that they offer. You've then got right at the other end of the spectrum, you've got that full B-class, which the units you see here, these are all B-class units. So they're what we call full vacuum units, and these will generally, loading is in exactly the same way. You're still loading the tray, instruments side by side. We're not multi-stacking of instruments or anything like that, because that just inhibits where the steam gets to. They can accommodate everything that S can accommodate, but with the exception, they can also accommodate wrapped hollow hand pieces, wrapped hollow instruments. So that's the important thing. Surgical kits, if you happen to do surgical and you happen to get custom drape packs non-sterile, then they would take custom drape packs. Certainly implant kits through the use of boxes, storage boxes and implant kits in their general would definitely be going through a Class B because of the nature of what's in those implant kits, with the amount of lumined and hollow and very intricate parts in there, and also the amount of air you're going to have in there as well. What you'll notice with all of these autoclaves, and certainly with the B-class autoclave, is you'll see a graph there. You'll see graphs next to them. Now, what those graphs kind of tell us is they're telling us at what point air is being drawn out of the chamber, and also at what point the heat is rising. So the higher the bar goes up, the higher the temperature, and the bar across the bottom is the time that it's taking. Now what happens is within the B class, as we can see, there's an element there where we have what we call vacuum drying. Now, vacuum drying, all vacuum autoclaves will do a vacuum drying. It's sometimes we get people asking that it seems a bit pointless doing a vacuum drying. Why would you do that? You've got all the air out. There shouldn't be any reason to do a vacuum drying because all the vacuum pulses have happened beforehand. And one of the things with vacuum autoclaves that we look at is obviously the time that vacuum autoclaves take, purely because they're trying to suck air out. They don't just suck the air out all in one go. It's a process of pulses to draw that air out. Now, one of the things they do vacuum drying, and vacuum drying, the reason why they do that is that vacuum drying is also that negative pressure. It lowers that boiling point, so you get a more desired result gently and more efficiently as well during the vacuum drying. So it helps to facilitate and ensuring that those instruments come out completely dry. So a couple of other questions. How should it be loaded correctly? Big question we always get. Clear view pouches, traditional self-seal pouches. Okay, clear view up, clear view down. Helix test. Okay, where to place it in the chamber. And then on the perforated trays, paper on the perforated tray, yes or no. So basics of sterilisation, what we need to look at with sterilisation is obviously we're trying to ensure that all of the loads are sterilised properly. It's important that the load that we put into the chamber, we match the program to the load we're putting in the chamber. Because if we don't match the load that we're putting in the chamber, then we're not going to get full sterility. So if your autoclave, for example, has a quick cycle, which sometimes could be a half load cycle, and we decide to load the entire autoclave up, we could run into problems whereby we might not guarantee full sterility of the instruments, or we could well come out with loads that are wet because drying has another chance to do itself properly. So it is important that we do refer to the manufacturers of the autoclaves that you have to ensure that we are loading that autoclave correctly. Okay, that's the important part. Using a perforated aluminium tray is the optimum benefit in terms of ensuring that we get no condensates on there. So what you'll notice with most perforated aluminium trays is obviously you've got a multiple evenly spaced holes throughout the tray. And then you should also have drainage holes at the end of each corner just to allow the water to drain out that is condensed on there, and it helps to condense out. Sometimes I see it with practices, they'll put paper down on these trays. It's important that we don't have paper on those trays, because if you imagine when that is in the chamber itself, okay, and if you have paper in those trays, you restrict the amount of drying. Because what can happen within the sterilizers is the air, the steam, and even the drying will circulate around that internal chamber. So what it's doing is it's either coming up through the trays, or it's going down through the trays, very much dependent on the manufacturer. Now, what can happen is if you have paper on a tray, for example, and you've got your steam coming up, and even if you had your steam and your drying coming downwards, that paper is going to inhibit the ability to get to the next trays. So it is always no paper on the trays. Okay, put paper on the trays afterwards if you want. Put paper on the trays when they go onto the bracket table in the surgery, but certainly not paper on the trays when they're in the sterilizer. Sterilizing containers. Okay, your practice may well be looking at things like these, which are containers. Now, what these do, in essence, is these negate the need for any pouches. So the idea is you would either use a cassette, a clip tray, or something like that within the actual box, or you'd place loose instruments in the box. Ideally, you want to be looking at instruments that you're not going to use all the time. Now, the idea with these is once the instruments are loaded in there, that whole box then would go into the autoclave. You'll notice there's no rack in there. I've taken the rack out, so you don't put the rack in. And then you place the next tray on top of it. Then you place the next one on top of that. And the idea then is that they would then be fully sterilized, and the drying would get round to all of those as well to ensure they're dry. So that's the box side of it, if people are using the box, or even if you're considering using the box as well. With your paper, if you have what we call a toast rack for your sterilizer, I see quite a few of them out there. I don't see many practices using them, but this is where your instruments theoretically will go like this, your pouched instruments. Well, the way you would put your pouch in there would be either clear view to clear view or paper to paper. So you're putting them the same way from each other. If you don't have a rack that sits in your pouches like this, then perforated tray. For a MELAG unit, you are placing the paper side down for MELAG units. The drying comes here. You then ensure the drying, it comes right through. Some, dependent on the manufacturers, will require the clear view side down, paper side up. But certainly for MELAG, we are looking the paper side down. Likewise with pouches, it's important that you don't overload the actual tray. You wouldn't want any more than a third of a pouch cropping onto the next pouch, because obviously what happens then is you inhibit any drying capability. So you certainly wouldn't want a pouch on top of a pouch. You could put a pouch next to that, but if the pouch next to it's slightly too big, you'd be looking at no more than a third coming onto this pouch. Okay? Otherwise you inhibit the ability to be able to dry the pouches correctly. It is really important when we put our pouches in that we don't overload the pouches. So if we're using self-seal pouches, which a lot of the UK are, then self-seal pouches tend to be available in a variety of different ranges. What you'll tend to find is you'll never find a pouch that will exactly fit what you want it to fit. Certainly if it comes down to using clip trays, for example. What tends to happen is you'll buy a pouch that's too big and then you fold it over. Now, if we overload this pouch, when that pouch is in the sterilizer, okay, paper side down, the steam will come in. That pouch is going to want to breathe. It's very similar to putting a bowl in the microwave with cling film on the top of the bowl. Okay, as soon as that microwave turns on, what happens if you look through is the cling film tries to expand, so it gets bigger and bigger. And that's what's happening inside here with the pouch. So the instrument is inside. This instrument is perfect for this pouch. So the instrument is inside, steam comes in, that pouch will want to breathe. If you have overloaded that with instruments, what can happen is as that pouch breathes, you can find that you can either get perforations in the back or you could get perforations in the top where it opens up. As soon as it opens up, you've not got a correctly sealed, correctly sterilized instrument. Also, the paper element of here, bearing in mind you've got steam in this chamber, so this will get wet, okay, and that will help, or that won't help, but it will mean that that paper will rip a lot easier when that instrument comes through. So it's really important that we don't overload the pouches, okay. And also we'll self-seal pouches. It's really important that we follow the perforation on the top of the pouch and that we're folding along the perforation and we are pressing from the middle out to get a nice tight seal. I see a lot of times practices are like this. We see them sealed like that. That does not create an airtight seal. there is air present in there. If there's air present, if air can get in, pathogens, airborne particles can get in there as well. So it is important that we have it like that. And that becomes quite important, particularly if we are transferring these back into the clinical area. If you've expelled aerosol into the air from your high-speed turbines, dependent on the particle size, and you'll never know what the particle size is, that can take between 10 minutes and 2 days to fall to floor level. So that's constantly falling down onto everything going in, everything coming out of your clinical area. So make sure we use the correct size pouch for the instruments we're loading in there. Don't overload the pouches. Don't have instruments multi-stacked on top of each other within the pouch as well. Okay, because again, if you've got multiple instruments that are bunched up on top of each other, the steam's not going to get around. The steam's not going to move those instruments for you. So it needs to be able to get into contact with the surfaces. The steam will only sterilize surfaces it gets into contact with. If it can't get in contact with the surface, it can't sterilize the surface. Make sure that if we are using a mixed load, because with vacuum autoclaves, for example, you know, as a vacuum, they are indicated for pouched instruments, but we can run this rack inside of here, or we could even run the one inside of here as well, okay? And basically, we could have pouched instruments in here, or we could have unpouched instruments in here. They can all get run on a vacuum cycle. What you would look at is the way that you load that instrument. So it's important that with it, you have all your heavy and unpacked instruments at the bottom. And then you have all your packed, your pouched instruments at the top. Okay. Likewise in here. So this takes 8 trays. So if we were half and half, so the 4 bottom ones would be unpouched instruments, so loose instruments, the ones we're going to use that day. All of the ones at the top would be those pouched instruments. So they'd be root elevators, things like that, things that don't get used that often, because we don't have to pouch every instrument. You get the 1-day storage if you're not pouching, and a 1-week storage if they're not stored in the clinical area. Obviously, everything outside of that, it's a good idea to pouch them. So always try to correctly load the sterilizer yourself as well. Always be aware you can put mixed loads in there. Just because it says it's a vacuum autoclave and it's for pouched instruments, it doesn't necessarily have to just be a full load of pouched instruments. You can use that unit to put other instruments. And we see this a lot with hand pieces. So, you know, you might want to process your pouched hand pieces in there and then question whether you could actually run the loose instruments in there as well, the unpouched instruments. Well, the simple answer to that is yes, you can. Maximize the chamber. I see it a lot where practices will come in, they'll put 1 load of instruments on a tray, pop that in the sterilizer and then run it, okay? It's always the best thing to use the sterilizer to its full capability. I mean, this unit here, for example, this will process these 8 trays you see here in 10 minutes. If that was a load of unwrapped instruments, it would do them in 10 minutes, including drying. So there are pieces of equipment that are incredibly quick. This unit, this will take 2 full-size dental trays. If you were to put 2 unwrapped in there, that's 6.5 minutes. If you were to put 2 wrapped loads in there, that's 15 minutes. So, you know, the units are becoming quicker, but you gain the best benefit from them when you maximize the loads that you put into them as well. It's important that your sterilizer has a really good selection of programs, and those programs will match the load types, because there is not one size fits all when it comes to a sterilizer. But what we try to look at is giving you programs that maximize your working day. So you'll have universal load, okay? And the universal program, even though it might say hollow, narrow hollow, universal in a vacuum autoclave is a vacuum cycle. And that's where this question comes up. Well, can I do mixed loads in there? That universal cycle is a full load. And that was where you could have a full load, mixed load of wrapped and hollow, wrapped and unwrapped, or you could put a full load of wrapped on there as well. You then got quick program B, which in essence would be that. Okay, it's what we call a half load. So that would be a half load of wrapped, or it could be 2 trays of wrapped at the top and 2 trays of unwrapped at the bottom, mixed load going in there, and that'll run that load. And most modern autoclaves will have these selection. You've then got your quick S, which is your typical day-to-day load. That is a full load of instruments. Unwrapped is always unwrapped, or the single wrapped solid instruments, but primarily unwrapped. Okay, and that generally would be your day-to-day cycle. You've then got gentle programs and you've got prion programs. We don't really use prion programs in the UK. There are occasionally we will use gentle programs. Gentle program is typically a 121 temperature. There are some surgical instruments that can't go through 134 sterilization, so they would require a 121 sterilization. Some bite wings, things like that can't go through the higher temperatures. So have a unit that's got a good selection of program and make sure that we select the right program to the load types that we're going in there. We then got routine tests that we have to do with them. So all of these are driven by the manufacturers, very much down to what the manufacturers will recommend. But typically what we're doing on a daily basis for an autoclave is we're making sure that the door gasket is in good condition, that we've got no rips or tears in these door gaskets, okay? And that also the door opens and closes correctly, that there's no grinding. When that door goes up to the sterilizer, we're making sure that it's not dropped, that it sits at a nice level, okay? We're then performing something called a steam penetration test using, or a vacuum, of a Bowie Dick test using a helix device, okay, which I'll come on to in just a sec. And what helix devices are designed for is to emulate an overextended lumen instrument. So I'll come on to that in just a sec. You've then got, on a weekly basis for all vacuum autoclaves and S-class autoclaves, we have something called the VAC test. And the VAC test, what that's looking at, we take this one out, it's basically looking at this chamber and ensuring that this chamber hasn't got any microfractures in it. Because what can happen if there's microfractures in here, it can inhibit its ability to pull a vacuum, which then brings its own problems. So it has to be done on a cold chamber. So it'd be generally the first program you do first thing in the morning, once a week. Run that vacuum test, everything comes out of it. So it's a cold chamber only. It takes about 5 minutes or so, depending on the manufacturers. Run it, it'll give you a readout. Has it passed? Has it failed? Okay. If it's failed, it could well be that the door gasket needs changing. So check the door gasket first of all. If the door gasket does need changing, then let the unit cool down, run it again. Chances are it'll probably pass. If the door gasket is in good order, it's worth getting an engineer out to have a look at it, just to double check. And then we have the helix, which I'll come on to in just 2 seconds. So helix device, this is designed to emulate an overextended lumen instrument. So we have 1.5 meters of tubing inside of here, okay? Holes on both ends, hole on one end, links up to the little cap at the top. We then have a class 5 indicator that goes in the top, okay? And that goes in. These are only required for vacuum autoclaves. So we pop it into the middle shelf on the unit, okay? Go onto the tray, close the door. Your autoclave will have either a steam penetration cycle or a Bowie Dick cycle, is what they tend to be. What will happen is a vacuum will pull, and what that vacuum is doing is it's evacuating all the air from the inside of that 1.5 meter tubing. Steam is then injected down that 1.5 meters of tubing right the way to the very end, where you have your little control strip that sits in that end. That little control drip is looking for a temperature, 134 to 137 that you can see on there. And it's also looking for time as well. What happens then is that indicator will change color. And by that indicator changing color, it shows you that a vacuum has been pulled and that steam has been able to penetrate the entire 1.5 meters and get to that little test strip. So it's showing you that if you put a handpiece through there, that handpiece will get sterilized correctly right the way through the chamber, because there's no handpiece that has 1.5 meters worth of tubing, internal lumen. I mean, that would be a whopping great big handpiece if there was. So no. Okay, and there are various other tests that you do. So you've got your helixes, you've got your type 5 indicator strips. Some autoclaves will use type 6 indicator strips. Non-vax, you'll do a type 6 indicator first cycle of the day. You've then got the Bowie Dix. Bowie Dix tend to be for any practices that are using textiles, things like that, to sterilize. It very much tends to be laboratories or veterinary or somewhere like that will use a Bowie Dix where they're putting textiles through the unit as well. Look after your internal chamber. What we want from our chamber is something like this. Okay, what can happen is the image you see there on the right. We can get a lot of tarnishing happening inside of that chamber. So using something like Chamber Protect, which is a MELAG product, you can use this on any sterilizer. The idea with this is once a week you would take all that internal furniture out, non-linting cloth, and you get a microfiber cloth with it as well. Spray into the cloth, and then you're wiping around that entire chamber. And you're also wiping the door gasket as well. What will happen if you keep on top of that, it'll keep your internal chamber like the image you see there on the left. Okay, so it'll keep it nice and clean, nice and looking good. Nothing worse than getting a brand new unit and then a week or so later, or 2 weeks later, whatever it might take, suddenly you've got a dull brown, horrible looking chamber inside. It looks so much nicer and also works effectively a lot better with it's nice and clean. So that's an important element we need to look at. Don't forget also with things like these, you've got dust filters. So look at this one. Okay, your units may well have dust filters. Most dust filters need to be changed after a duration of time, which the units will tell you. Okay, so this unit is 1,000 cycles, so always look at the dust filters as well. And then we've got documentation approval. Documentation approval can be done in several different ways. We've either got a manual method, which is traditionally the way we've always done things, or what's happening lately is we are entering into the 4th industrial revolution, which is that digital revolution, and everything is now becoming a lot more digital. Trying to eliminate our carbon footprint, trying to eliminate the unnecessary amount of waste that we have and that we generate. Dentistry, as a division of healthcare, we do generate a lot of waste and we want to be more sustainable. We've seen it with HTMO 701. That document being implemented last year is really pushing and driving with the back of DEFRA and also the NHS's plans as well to becoming carbon neutral, to having a zero impact on the environment. So we have no negative impact. So we're seeing a lot of things coming digital. All of these units are already digital. So there's a lot of ways. And what we'll see, a lot of equipment nowadays is becoming a lot digital. It's not just your OPGs or your scanners. It's now your treatment centers are digital. All of your decon room equipment is digital. We are so into that digital revolution now. So anything that we have within the UK, all of our logs from these, so our little test strips from our Helix devices, our cycle logs that are churned out of our sterilizers and our washer disinfectors every single cycle, every single day, must be kept for a minimum of 2 years within England and Wales. Within Scotland, they need to be kept for the lifetime of the equipment. Okay. The SHTM 105 came out last year, and it's slightly changed. The lifetime of the equipment, this info. If you're in the Republic of Ireland, you're keeping that information for 8 years minimum as well. England, Wales, that time span of 2 years is likely to change at some point. It's just a matter of where. Now, how do we record? Many different ways that autoclaves and washer disinfectors can record data now. So some of these you will be familiar with already. First one, documentation using a common USB stick, or it might be using a little CF card, or you might well have a reader that's got an SD card in it. They're all good forms of recording parameters. And what they tend to do with these ones, it fits into the screen, but you might get a little box that your unit sits on there with your little SD card in, or it could be a separate unit that the USB stick sits in. And what that's doing is basically recording when you run your S cycle or your B cycle. Everything that would have been put on your traditional printout will be recorded on the data logger. So it's looking at time, temperature, pressure. It's giving it a date stamp. It's telling you what time you started the cycle, what time the cycle finished. It'll note the serial number of the autoclave. It'll note the cycle number of the autoclave. Okay, and then it'll say on there, did it pass or did it fail? And that gets recorded on the data logger. So that's the first element, keeping those 2 years, England, Wales, lifetime of the equipment for Scotland, minimum 8 years for the Republic of Ireland. Second element you got is approval of sterilisation batch. So that is where we're again looking at 2 ways. We may well be utilising a manual system in the form of a logbook. And that logbook is we are noting those tests that we've done. And we are noting the little stick as well, the little helix test strip as well, or even the class 6 test strip for our non-vax as well. And they are being recorded in our logbooks that are then kept for those previous durations. And then you've got labeling of the package as well, either labeling with a label gun or labeling with a barcode label printer, very similar to this unit here that you may well have, that then churns out barcode label. Lot more equipment pieces nowadays are coming out with barcode labels. The beauty of these is that label takes everything that's on here, the USB stick, okay, puts also the date that they expire on there as well. So you would preset it to a year storage or 6 month storage, whatever you like. We're obviously a year, and then that will be on there. So that saves you from writing on the pouch or even using your stamp gun to write on the pouch. The autoclaves themselves can also help you with batch approval. So these units, you'll notice they've got quite large screens on them. These units, certain models will have something called batch approval. And what that does is it basically stops any burden of issue, any issue there. It puts the onus of responsibility on the user that has released that batch. And it all comes down to if a patient comes into the practice, they don't have to prove they contracted something from the practice. It is the practice's responsibility to prove that they didn't. So it's all about having every single element backed up. So the way these work is that once that cycle has finished, each individual user of the unit will be given a 4-digit PIN code, 1000, 2000, 3000, 4000, whatever you want. You would decide on the codes. And then when it finishes, it pops up on the screen that the user has to put in their little 4-digit code. So they will log in. It will then ask them, has the indicator, i.e. the little test strip that you either put onto the pouches or you put on the helix, has that changed color? Okay, yes or no? You've got yes, it changed color, you would tick yes. It's then asking you, were there any error codes on the unit? Did the little warning bar come up with a little error on there to ensure, did it pick up any issues? If it was all fine and it said on the screen, cycle completed successfully, then you'll tick yes. And at that point then, The unit will then ask you, how many of these little labels do you want, okay, for your pouches that you've got inside there? So for, for future sake, I've put 10 pouches in there. So I want 10 labels, okay? So I'll put in 10 and then press the button, it'll print out those 10. What happens then is these little labels get printed out of the barcode label printer, and they will have obviously the sterilization date, the expiry date on there, which you can see in the bottom line, the second from the top line. It'll have the model, it'll have the serial number, it'll have who released it, that code as well. That then gets stuck onto the pouch, and then within clinics, within the surgeries, there would be a little barcode scanner that you would then scan the barcodes of those instruments when you're about to use them on the next patient. Excuse me, let me just... And then all of that data would go into the patient's notes. So clinician has a patient in the treatment center, opened up the patient's notes, you've bought the instruments in there, or the instruments have been bought in, scan them with the barcode scanner, all of the data that's on there is brought straight into the patient's notes, so that then there's a burden of proof there. You can exactly prove that those instruments did pass through that program successfully. And then we look at the range. This is the range of the units that MELAG produce. Okay, so looking at that washer disinfector, looking at the packaging, looking at the sterilizers from the small 5-litre units, right the way up to the big 50-litre units, which will take up to 16 dental trays. Okay, also looking at a unit like this called the Autoclave, which will also take up to 8 handpieces cleaned, lubricated and sterilized, and then you're still able to utilize the back of the chamber for sterilization as well. So there's a whole plethora of different products there. Within your decon room, shout about the decon room. One thing about decon is decon doesn't generate any additional income for the practice, but what decon does do is if decon is done right, it generates a lot of patient satisfaction for the practice, and it is something to shout about. I have a lot of practices putting glass around the decon rooms. You could argue, yes, you've got to keep it tidy, but it's a great way of shouting off your entire process. So always shout about it. If you want to know anything about MELAG, it's always worth keeping up to date. Follow them on Insta, Facebook, or LinkedIn. You can always follow myself as well if you're not following me already at Decompete. And we will see you afterwards. See you soon. What I'll do now is let me just quickly close this down just to see if there are any questions. If my thing's working, let me just see. And if there's any questions, let them load up. Should a type 5 indicator strip be used for each batch sterilized? This is for sterilizers that don't have computer data storage. Very much depends on the unit and the manufacturer. I would strongly recommend that some form of classification, typically a class 6, would be used. What class 5s do is class 5s look at a multitude of parameters. So they are the best indicators themselves. Class 6s are cycle specific. So some manufacturers will stipulate class 6s to be used on every single cycle if you don't have a data logger, purely because the class 6 will only change color when the temperature's been hit, when the time's been hit, and also when the steam has penetrated the lacquer on the test strip and changed its color. Okay, so some manufacturers will stipulate if you don't have a data logger, then you should use a class 6. In terms of the regulations, so 0105, WHT 0105, so forth, don't necessarily stipulate that. You're following manufacturer's guidance. Easiest thing, if you don't have a data logger, the cost-effective way of doing it is that there are a lot of companies that will retrofit data loggers onto onto the unit. Or if you can't have a data logger retrofitted onto it, they could retrofit at least a printer onto it. So it might be worth looking at that. If you want to message me your details, tell me what unit you've got, then I can certainly find out if it can be retrofitted, because it could, over the long run, be more cost effective for you to do that. But that's something we can help you with. Can I email nurses' names who attended the webinar for CBD? Yeah, email them over, that's fine. What is the name of that cleaner? This is cool. So this one is called Chamber Protect, this cleaner. What it does, I haven't got them here. It comes with 50 dry linting cloths, because the idea is you use it once a week. So it comes with 50 of the non-linting cloths, and also comes with a microfiber cloth as well, which you can use afterwards. But it's basically isopropanol based, and it's great at removing any of these residual debris from the inside. So I'd highly recommend it, and I'd highly recommend it not just if you've got MELAG, but use it for any units. Your main dealer will be able to supply it for you. If a helix doesn't change color completely, but does change, is that no, it's got to change completely. If it's only just slight parts of it changing, it could be indicative that there could be a problem. Now, it may well be that your door gasket needs changing. Okay, as simple as that. It might well be the door gasket needs changing and it's not quite being able to pull the vacuum, because if that's not changing completely, that could be indicative that there could be some air still in the actual helix itself, which is inhibiting the steam to get there. You should get a complete change on the helix. Can you confirm B sterilizers paper side down or up? Very much depends on the unit. If you've got a MELAG unit, it's paper side down, so like this. But mid-mark, for example, they are paper side up. It very much depends on the manufacturers. Again, let me know what unit you've got, and I can probably find out for you afterwards if you let me know. How often does the chamber need to be cleaned? Once a week, just once a week. Yeah, you don't need to do it too often. Remember, you're not, with it, you're not just doing the chamber, you're doing all around this door seal, because this door seal here, this metal bit, what can sometimes happen is you can get debris in here, particularly if your decon room's quite small. I know what these decon rooms are like, and very stuffy. There's a lot of debris in there. There can be a lot of airborne particles in there. You can get little bits inside this door thing, and what can happen then is, remember the door gasket is here, this little rubber. What can happen is if there's debris on here, it might inhibit that gasket from creating a nice tight seal, particularly with vacuum autoclaves, because vacuum autoclaves are reliant on this creating a nice tight seal there as well. So yeah, once a week, all of this area, all the door gasket, and obviously all the chamber as well, and then throw the cloth away afterwards. What is the best autoclave to buy? Little bit biased, obviously, but out of the range, there are two units that I would significantly say. First being the 41B, which is the premium model, which is in essence this unit, purely because it takes up to 8 dental trays, and it processes those 8 dental trays of unwrapped instruments in 10 minutes, and up to 9 kilos of instruments, which is a lot of instruments. There's no unit like it on the market. It's completely unique in the market, purely because it is so uber quick. That will also sterilize 4, so half dental trays of pouched instruments in 17 minutes. So again, from start to finish, all including drying. And the way these units do it is they use hospital technology. So basically you can see the chamber here, but on the outside, the bit you can't see, there's another chamber. So there's a void in between those chambers, and what's in that void is basically steam. that is at temperature on demand. You press start, it'll get injected straight the way through. So that's the first one. The second one, purely because of speed and also its ability to be quite mini for worktop space, will be the little 105 or the 305. And this unit will take 2 trays. It is a full vacuum autoclave, but it's also S's. These are all full vacs. And that'll process 2 trays up to 2 kilos in 6.5 minutes of unwrapped instruments. So again, incredibly quick. If you want something slightly bigger, then you've got this one here, which is a 50 litre, and that'll take 25 up to 25 kilos of instruments. 16. So you're looking at 16 of these standard size dental trays will go in that unit. Okay. And that is the same technology as this little unit. So it's uber quick, incredibly quick. So there's a selection there. If you want more details, head to the MELAG website, or I can always send you some more details afterwards. I have girls struggling to get on Teams. Oh, I do apologise. Sorry for that. If you've struggled to get on Teams, it will be recorded. If you drop me an email afterwards, obviously just with your details on there, as soon as the recording's available, I'll get you the recording. And then the guys that have missed it can then re-watch it afterwards and get their CPD for it. So yeah, sorry about that. It's the beauty of technology. Sometimes you can't really help it, I'm afraid. So I do apologise. How do we get our certificates? If you didn't register, hopefully you registered. If you did register, your certificates will be sent out shortly afterwards via the registration. If you weren't able to register, send me an email, either gibbons@melag.com. Send that to me, and then I can get your CPD sent out afterwards. How do we receive? Okay, here's another one. How do we receive certificates? Yeah, like I just said. Should bagged instruments be placed paper side down in the mid-mark B? Yeah, mid-mark B. So mid-mark B is paper side up. So it's like that in the mid-mark B with the clear view down. And see if there's any more questions. That's it. I think that's it, guys. So hope everybody found that useful. As said, if you've got any questions, you can always fire them over. Either follow us on Insta, follow myself on Insta as well, or you can contact me via the gibbons@melag.com or info@decompete.co.uk as well. You can contact either way, whichever works best, and then we can get those questions and also get the recording over to you as well afterwards. Okay. Okay, guys, I will leave you to the rest of your day. Enjoy your lunch. What's left of lunch? Well, you haven't got any. Oh, no, lunch is done. So hopefully you'll have a really good afternoon, and we will see you all soon. Take care, guys.